$5. That was the crumpled wealth held tightly in the small hand. As the young girl in the pink long-sleeved shirt stood on the bustling city sidewalk, her gaze remained fixed on Vittorio, the man whose very name was a shadow over the city. She knew the stories of the Underworld kingpin, knew he was a predator a child should never approach. The city air was thick with the scent of exhaust and distant street food as the afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows against the concrete. In the distance, the usual rhythm of the city continued, unaware of the collision about to occur. Vittorio sat alone, his sharp, dark suit cutting a precise silhouette against the chaos of the street, his presence commanding even in total stillness. No guards flanked him, yet an invisible barrier of fear seemed to protect the space around him from any intrusion. It was as if the world itself recognized his authority, find the weakness and exploit it. It was a philosophy that had built his empire from the dark, but today it would be challenged by a single pink bow and a determined expression.
$5. That was the crumpled wealth held tightly in the small hand. As the young girl in the pink long-sleeved shirt stood on the bustling city sidewalk, her gaze remained fixed on Vittorio, the man whose very name was a shadow over the city. She knew the stories of the Underworld kingpin, knew he was a predator a child should never approach. The city air was thick with the scent of exhaust and distant street food as the afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows against the concrete. In the distance, the usual rhythm of the city continued, unaware of the collision about to occur. Vittorio sat alone, his sharp, dark suit cutting a precise silhouette against the chaos of the street, his presence commanding even in total stillness. No guards flanked him, yet an invisible barrier of fear seemed to protect the space around him from any intrusion. It was as if the world itself recognized his authority, find the weakness and exploit it. It was a philosophy that had built his empire from the dark, but today it would be challenged by a single pink bow and a determined expression. Vittorio noticed the child immediately, his sharp eyes missing nothing even in moments of apparent calm. Something in her determined approach made him pause his thoughts about business matters. She stopped precisely 3 feet from him, maintaining a cautious distance. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the slight tremble in her hands. "Are you Vittorio?" The question hung between them, bold and dangerous in the humid air. He considered sending her away with a cold word, as he would most strangers foolish enough to approach him. Instead, curiosity overtook caution, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that invited her to continue despite his better judgment. Lyra stepped closer then, extending both hands with the envelope pinched between small fingers. "I need to hire you, sir," she stated simply, no tears or dramatics coloring her request, "and I can pay." The absurdity of this child offering payment almost made his lips twitch with amusement, but the gravity in her eyes stopped any smile before it could form. Whatever brought her here was no trivial matter. "What kind of contract costs $5? He asked finally, his deep voice pitched low. It was all she had, she explained, but she believed it was enough for the hit she required. With an expertise born from years of reading people, Vittorio accepted the envelope, noting the care with which it had been sealed. The precision spoke of desperation, of something precious contained within flimsy paper. Lyra watched him open it with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung in the balance. Inside lay the carefully folded bill, a down payment on a miracle she was bold enough to ask for. Vittorio unfolded the small, square note with the same clinical focus he used to scan intelligence reports. The handwriting was a wobbling mix of effort and innocence, the careful printing of a child trying to appear grown up. He expected a name, a location, perhaps a plea to punish a schoolyard bully or a thieving landlord. Instead, the first line landed with the weight of a physical blow. "Please kill the loneliness," it began. His eyes scanned the rest of the message as the air around him seemed to grow cold.
The house is so quiet at night because the men in charge take all the joy for themselves. They say we are worth nothing, and they hide the medicine and the food. I want you to make the sadness go away. I want a real Christmas for my family." The seasoned crime boss, a man who had stared down federal agents and executed rivals without a flicker of hesitation, felt a sudden, sharp tightness in his chest. It was an absurdity that transcended his world of calculated violence and strategic threats. He had been hired for many things: executions, betrayals, the seizing of territories, but never for the restoration of hope. He looked up from the note to Lyra's face, seeing the knowledge in her eyes that no child should possess, a weariness mirrored in his own reflection. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice softer now, the predatory edge replaced by a burgeoning concern he didn't yet recognize as grace. Lyra didn't waver. She explained that she had heard the men who ran the orphanage speaking his name in whispers of terror, claiming that everyone, even the law, was afraid of Mr. Vittorio. Her logic was a flawless, terrifying simplicity. She had sought out the city's greatest predator to protect her from the smaller ones hunting her spirit. A distant church bell tolled, marking the hour as the sunset faded into a deep, bruised purple across the city skyline. Vittorio folded the note with trembling fingers and slid it into his inner pocket, next to his heart, rather than returning it with the money. It felt like a contract more binding than any document he had ever signed in blood. "Keep your money," he said, closing her small hand around the $5 bill with a gentleness few had ever witnessed from him. "You have already paid enough." Lyra looked confused, her armor finally cracking as she asked if he would truly help them. Vittorio nodded once, a movement carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man who had just accepted a mission to declare war on the dark. Vittorio did not return to his headquarters that night. Instead, he sat in the darkened rear of his car, parked a block away from the St. Jude's Home for Children, watching through the tinted glass. In his world, reconnaissance was a cold, mathematical process of identifying structural weaknesses and high-value targets. But as he peered at the gray, peeling exterior of the orphanage, he wasn't looking for security cameras. He was looking for the loneliness Lyra had described. What he saw through the telephoto lens held by his specialist, Bobby, was a scene that no police report could fully capture. The children moved with a clinical detachment, their shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow, their eyes reflecting the same knowledge no child should possess that he had seen in Lyra. He watched a man in a stained shirt, one of the administrators, snatch a piece of bread from a small boy's hand with a sneer of casual cruelty. There was no laughter here, no gentle breeze rustling through palms, only a sterile and oppressive silence that reminded Vittorio of the prisons he had spent his life avoiding. "Everything, Paolo," Vittorio said to his phone, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that made his assistant skip any questions. "I want the ledger of every cent that enters that building. I want to know who is eating steak while those children eat dust. I want the names of every background figure who looks the other way." As the data began to populate Bobby's laptop, the reality crystallized. Funds meant for medicine were being diverted to gambling dens, and the protection the orphanage claimed to provide was merely a veneer for a profitable system of neglect. Vittorio studied the glossy photograph of the head administrator, a man who radiated the particular blend of insecurity and arrogance he'd seen in every common predator. For the first time in 30 years, Vittorio felt a sensation that wasn't calculated rage, but a protective note that surprised even his inner circle. He realized that these children were the least of these, the sacred and untouchable souls his own code had once sworn to respect, but his lifestyle had long ignored. He wasn't just planning a hit anymore, he was preparing a reckoning. "They think they are safe because no one is watching," Vittorio whispered to the shadows. "They don't realize the king has just arrived."
Vittorio's office was silent, the air thick with the smell of old leather and the cold weight of the files spread across his mahogany desk. Frank and Bobby stood like shadows, awaiting the command that usually signaled the end of a rival's territory. But the atmosphere tonight carried a different, sharper electricity. Vittorio's finger tapped rhythmically on the photograph of Marcus Thorne, the orphanage's head administrator, whose sneering face was now linked to a digital paper trail of stolen lives. To the world, Thorne was a man of charity. To Vittorio's surveillance team, he was a common predator skimming medical funds to fuel a secret gambling addiction in the city's backrooms. He's built a cage of thorns around those children and calls it a home, Vittorio said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low resonance. He wasn't looking for a military-style execution. He wanted a total uprooting. The plan formed with the clinical precision of a chess master moving pieces toward a checkmate. Vittorio gave the order to buy up Thorne's debts from every bookie in the tri-state area, effectively owning the man's life before the sun could rise. The confrontation did not happen in a dark alley, but in the sterile, cold hallways of the orphanage after the children had been put to bed. Vittorio arrived without the usual fanfare of sirens or gunfire, his presence alone causing the air to recognize a higher authority. When Thorne looked up from his desk to find the Mafia Boss standing in the doorway, his arrogance dissolved into a pale, shaking terror. Vittorio didn't raise his hand or his voice. He simply placed the framed $5 bill on the desk, a contract from a power Thorne couldn't fathom. "You've been spending money that belongs to the king's children," Vittorio whispered, his eyes narrowing with a light that suggested a reckoning far deeper than a business dispute. He laid out the evidence of the diverted funds and the gambling debts now held in his own hand. The ultimatum was absolute. Thorne and his corrupt board would sign their resignations and leave the state by dawn, or they would face the warehouse job from which no predator ever returned. By the time the distant church bells marked the change of the watch, the thorns had been pulled, leaving the soil ready for a different kind of growth. By the time the sun began to peek over the city's jagged horizon, the thorns had been uprooted, but the soil was still cold and bare. Vittorio understood that removing a predator was only half the contract. The hit Lyra requested required a total restoration of the spirit. He began to move with a quiet intensity, setting the machinery of his organization toward a mission of hidden deliverance. No one in the city would know the source of the sudden change, for Vittorio chose to become the secret sower, funneling resources through a labyrinth of legitimate-seeming channels. The transformation began with the arrival of unbranded trucks at the orphanage's gates. Men in professional uniforms, their faces kind and their movements efficient, began to replace the broken locks and scrub away the sterile, oppressive grime of the past decade. They weren't soldiers of the underworld, but top-tier contractors hired through obscure real estate agents to ensure the children's sanctuary was safe and warm. Inside the kitchen, the dusty shelves were suddenly stocked with fresh fruit, meats, and grains, appearing as a clerical error in the supply chain that favored the vulnerable. Vittorio watched from the shadows of his black car, hidden behind the tinted glass, as the first signs of life returned to the building. He saw a specialty pharmacy delivery van pull up, carrying the medications Catherine and other sickly residents had been denied for years. He had personally reviewed the medical files, ensuring that progressive treatments, the ones insurance companies called experimental, were fully funded for the next 5 years. The most profound shift, however, was the atmosphere. The background figure of corruption had been replaced by a team of caregivers who spoke with kind authority, their salaries paid by a prestigious law firm that claimed to be fulfilling the anonymous wishes of a wealthy estate. As a new playground was assembled in the yard, Vittorio felt the protective note in his heart grow stronger. He was sowing seeds in a garden he might never walk in,
buying back the childhoods that had been sold to the dark. He realized that while his part was removing the obstacles, the children's own resilience would be what transformed potential into reality. Vittorio sat in the suffocating silence of his penthouse, the city lights reflecting off the dark amber of his scotch like distant, unquenchable fires. On the desk before him lay the velvet box containing a silver bracelet and the framed $5 bill, a contract that had begun as an absurdity but had transformed into an indictment of his entire existence. For decades, his armor had been forged in the cold philosophy of finding a weakness and exploiting it, a belief system that had built his empire but left his soul a hollowed-out fortress. He felt a momentary melancholy, a sensation he had suppressed since he was a boy no older than Lyra. In his world, empathy was a fatal flaw, yet the image of the children's laughter, a sound so rare it felt like a miracle, kept piercing through his practiced reserve. He found himself unable to simply walk away from their story as he had done with 1,000 other business transactions. The protective note he had felt in the park was no longer a passing impulse. It was a cracking of the very foundations of his identity. He walked to the window, watching the city he supposedly owned. He had spent his life accumulating power that was maintained with fear. Yet a 9-year-old girl with a pink bow had wielded more true authority with $5 than he had with all his guns. The internal battle raged. The predator within him whispered that this was a vulgar distraction, a weakness that his enemies would eventually sense. But a deeper, quieter voice suggested that some debts couldn't be measured in dollars, and that this was the first time in his life he was building something that wasn't destined to eventually crumble into blood and ash. Vittorio recognized that the hit he had accepted was performing its most violent work on his own hardened heart. He wasn't just fixing a building, he was confronting the man he might have become in another lifetime, before the dark had claimed him. As the distant church bells marked the pre-dawn hour, Vittorio realized the armor wasn't protecting him anymore. It was only keeping him from the light. He picked up the phone, his voice steady but carrying a new, profound sincerity. "Paolo," he said, "don't just monitor the orphanage. I want a scholarship fund established. I want every door that was closed to those kids to be kicked open." The transition from a predator to a guardian was almost complete, and for the first time in 30 years, the shadow over Vittorio's face seemed to lift. The gray, peeling exterior of St. Jude's was stripped away, replaced by a facade that breathed warmth into the sterile street. What had once been a prison of neglected dreams was now a sanctuary, a place where the architecture itself seemed to reflect a new, invisible protection. Inside, the narrow, oppressive hallways were widened, flooded with light from newly installed windows that faced a backyard where the children could finally play safely within the privacy of a wooden fence. The background figure of corruption had been replaced by caregivers who moved with the kind authority of those who saw children as sacred and untouchable. Vittorio watched the progress from a distance, noting how the constant undercurrent of fear had gradually dissolved into a lived experience of peace. He saw a parent-teacher conference being held in the new administrative office, a normal activity that had once been an impossible dream for these isolated souls. The neighborhood children, who once avoided the building with whispered warnings, now played regularly with the orphans, their parents no longer steering them away. It was as if the shadow of the previous administration's volatile presence had lifted completely, allowing a normal childhood to finally take root in the soil he had cleared. The most significant change was the altar of restoration in the center of the home, a quiet library filled with books and technology provided through a district scholarship program. The children were no longer supplicants begging for scraps, they were students being groomed for a future they were now free to build. Vittorio realized that while he had provided the resources, the transformation was being carried out by the children themselves as their hyper-vigilance faded and was replaced by a burgeoning sense of security. He sat in his car, watching Lyra walk across the new lawn, her steps lighter than the day they had first met on the sidewalk. She no longer clutched her backpack like a shield. She moved with a confidence that suggested she understood the invisible hand guiding their good fortune. Vittorio realized that by rebuilding this home, he had inadvertently begun to rebuild the broken altar within himself, finding that some things could indeed be fixed if one was willing to pay the price of restoration. December arrived with a crispness that usually felt like a threat to those without shelter, but at the house on the hill, it brought a joy previously unknown. For the first time, a real tree stood in the center of the renovated parlor, decorated with ornaments that didn't feel like charity, but like a testament to a new beginning. Homemade cookies filled the kitchen with scents of cinnamon and vanilla, sweet fragrances that worked to erase the darker, sterile memories of the year before. The children, who once huddled in corners, now gathered around the hearth, their laughter no longer a vulgar sound, but a sacred melody that filled the rooms. Vittorio watched from the sidewalk, standing in the long shadows of the streetlights as a light snow began to fall, mirroring the sunset painted in orange and gold from the day he first accepted the contract. He saw the background figure of his own past fading away as he watched the children unwrap presents that arrived through a community outreach program, another layer of the legitimate narrative he had crafted to protect their peace. When Lyra's little sister hugged a plush toy, the expression of wide-eyed wonder on her face became Vittorio's most precious memory, a dividend that no amount of laundered money could ever buy. Inside, the light conquered the shadow. The children's demeanor had undergone a total transformation. The hyper-vigilance that once defined them had been replaced by a quiet security. Lyra stood by the window, her eyes catching the reflection of the tree's lights, and for a moment her gaze met the dark car parked at the curb. She didn't look away in fear. She offered a small, knowing smile that transcended the normal transactions of the world. Vittorio felt the final shards of his armor fall away. He realized that the hit was complete, not because a predator was gone, but because these children no longer believed the world was an arbitrary, cruel place where rage ruled without consequence. As the clock struck midnight, he felt a sense of restoration that bridged the man he was with the man he might have been in another lifetime. The following spring, exactly 1 year after the initial transaction, the black town car pulled slowly to the curb of the quiet, sun-drenched street. Vittorio watched through the glass as Lyra walked toward him, no longer the frightened orphan clutching a crumpled bill, but a young girl whose steps were light with the weight of reclaimed possibilities. As the rear door opened in a silent invitation, she slid into the leather seat, the backpack on her lap no longer serving as a shield, but as a vessel for the advanced learning materials provided through her new scholarship. "The reports from the academy are excellent," Vittorio stated, his voice carrying a sincere depth that bypassed the clinical detachment of his former life. He studied her face, measuring her growth rather than her desperation, and noted that the hypervigilance had finally been replaced by a quiet strength. Lyra smiled, sharing news of the other children, how the loneliness he was hired to kill had been replaced by a community of healing and growth. When she asked if he would keep watching over them, Vittorio felt a rare, genuine softness in his expression. "Not forever," he answered honestly, "but until it's no longer necessary. Some investments deserve protection." Before she returned to the sanctuary of the home, Vittorio reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny key. "Remember that your future is yours to build now," he said quietly as the diamond chip caught the light. "My part was simply removing what stood in your way." As Lyra stepped out of the car, Vittorio pulled a small frame from his console, the original $5 bill. He realized that while he had moved mountains for her, she had done the impossible for him. In a world of power and consequences, this child's faith had been the only force capable of executing a hit on the darkness within his own soul. He watched her disappear into the house of grace, knowing that this $5 contract had yielded the most profitable dividend of his life, his own redemption. The car pulled away, leaving the shadows behind as Vittorio finally drove toward the light.